What is up, y'all? My name is Josh Minyard. I'm a huge fan of movies, especially horror. If that sounds a little broad, it's because it is, as my love for horror runs pretty deep. It covers nearly every subgenre, spans across every decade from young to old, travels to different countries and languages, and for every quality classic dear to my heart, I welcome the equally bad just for good measure. But we're here to talk about a horror series that falls somewhere in between. There are 12 Friday the 13th films, and though Jason Voorhees doesn't always grace us with his presence, these movies always provide high body counts, wacky characters, and with the exception of an entry or two, they're always a ton of fun. Which brings us to this list. So it must be said, if you find yourself disagreeing with where I've got some of these movies ranked, just know this list is totally objective. That's right, objective.
I'm just kidding. But seriously.
No, in all seriousness, you're likely going to find your list is definitely different than mine. So when you do see that happening, just know...
Yo, man, it's cool. It's cool, man. It's cool.
With that said, let's get it going. Coming in at number 12 and dead last is Jason Goes to Hell, The Final Friday. For those unfamiliar, this is the entry where Jason Voorhees is trapped and blown up by the FBI. His heart somehow survives, and it's basically set up that this is what allows him to move freely from person to person, taking over their body through some little soul demon. Seriously, this is what the series ended up turning Jason into. Now, I know the franchise changed hands from Paramount to New Line, and the new creative team wanted to take Jason in a completely new direction. But this is just too much. I mean, Jason soul hops through people's bodies, demon monsters sprout from Earth and drag him to hell, and really, is that the Necronomicon book from Evil Dead? What are they going to do next, throw in Freddy Krueger? For what it's worth, I think this film would have been better if they took the route of Halloween 3. Make it so there's no Jason Voorhees and it's its own separate story with the Friday the 13th name. It still would have been bad and maybe a little too much like Wes Craven's Shocker, but at least it would have stood sturdier on its own feet and not have insulted the legacy of Jason Voorhees. The only positives here are the gore effects and the character Creighton Duke. Other than that, this movie sucks, and it's going to be a long time before I even think about watching it again. The production value of the Friday the 13th remake is very slick, and having been produced by Michael Bay, you can definitely feel that throughout the course of its runtime. However, I think this actually hurts the film more than helps it. The cinematography is so dark at times, and the editing is so fast, that I don't have time to process what I'm looking at, let alone feel any genuine fear. The original movies took a simplistic approach in regards to their production value by keeping the cinematography simple and utilizing point of view perspective. In my opinion, this is better suited for this series. You're in the woods, it's already quiet and creepy. Now throw in Jason, that's really all you need. In regards to Jason, I thought the filmmakers did a good job, but for some reason they decided he needed a jacket? Anyway, Derek Mears was solid in his portrayal. He's fast, just like the original Jason, and he may be the most vicious we've ever seen him portrayed. Unfortunately, he never comes off as scary, and I think that has more to do with the aforementioned cinematography and editing than his performance. The film also feels too much like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre remake, and never like a true Friday the 13th. They try to introduce some of the lore in the beginning, but it's a lousy attempt and really has no bearing on anything else the movie is trying to do. With the cast, Jared Padalecki and Danielle Panabaker are highlights, yet everyone else is pretty forgettable. Overall, I really wanted to like this movie, and it's possible that with time it'll grow on me, especially if another remake eventually comes around and makes this one look good in comparison. But as of now, this entry feels useless and will always hover near the bottom of the franchise. The next two movies on this list are pretty interchangeable, but I've got Jason X taking the lesser spot. So let's start with the positives. There's an insanely high body count, a fan favorite franchise kill, the dumb but also kind of cool Uber Jason, a fun throwback scene to the original Fridays, and of course the talented man portraying the silver screen slasher, Kane Hodder. Oh, that's it. Because on the flip side, the characters are horrible, the movie looks cheap, there's cringe one-liners. And when it comes down to it, this is basically the movie Alien substituted with Jason Voorhees. What was great about previous entries was that there were characters who didn't believe Jason was real, or didn't believe that he was alive and responsible for the murders occurring in the story. It made for more fun, waiting for those certain characters to be proven wrong when the truth was finally revealed. In Jason X, though there's some initial disbelief, everyone becomes aware of his threat and presence very early on in the film, and from there, it's basically just them being chased from scenario to scenario. There's definitely still some enjoyment to be had with this movie, and like a lot of these films in the series, you really just have to sit back and enjoy the dumb fun. Freddy vs. Jason is on par with Jason X for me, but I give it a slight edge just because the characters are better, and there's a bit more story to work with. And I do consider this a Friday the 13th movie, even though this entry leans significantly more on the Freddy Krueger side of things. But the main thing that makes this movie worthy, well, the answer's in the title. It's Freddy Krueger vs. Jason Voorhees. What more can you really want? If you turn off your brain and don't ask too many questions, there's definitely fun to be had. There's also a significant amount of characters, and though for the most part they're one-dimensional, they stick out just enough to warrant investment. The film also has a lot of movement, with the characters bouncing from one location to the next as they try to solve the Jason and Freddy riddle. My biggest issue with this movie is how cartoonish it is. I don't think there's a single death that doesn't look like it came out of a Tom and Jerry episode. I can understand this being the case in one of Freddy's nightmares, but it's present throughout the whole film. And it's not just the deaths, even the climactic fight between the two is cartoonish, and it gets so ridiculous that I'm honestly not even interested anymore. Creatively, I just don't understand why this route was taken. But to be fair, there's a lot of things about this movie I don't understand, and there's a lot of questions I'd like to ask the filmmakers. For instance, why is Freddy Krueger doing a fat bastard impersonation?
Hey, asshole! Up here!
Also, again, why is Jason wearing a jacket? Why do these later movies keep doing this? It makes even less sense this time because he was summoned from hell, and he obviously didn't need a jacket there. I'd also like to know why Jason is suddenly afraid of water, especially when he wasn't in the 10 movies prior. Despite the overall shortcomings of this movie, the film does have its moments, and it's still cool seeing the two horror icons battle in the big screen, regardless of how it was handled. It almost feels unfair to rank all the original Paramount Friday the 13th in the top 8 spots, but here we are. I'm not sure if I prefer them because of the nostalgia factor or if these entries just had more magic to them. Perhaps it's a little bit of both. One thing I will say is that the Paramount films were always made to be taken seriously, no matter how silly the premises started to get. A New Beginning sticks out for reasons positive and negative. The big con, of course, is the absence of Jason Voorhees. I also dock points for the overly sleazy tone and trashy characters. And while I love Tommy Jarvis as a character in the series, this is my least favorite version of him. He's damaged goods, hardly speaks, and is pretty useless in the climax. In fact, I'd say Ned from part 1 was more useful. On the plus side, we're treated to an abnormally high body count, the franchise's most attractive final girl, and some really freaky dream sequences of Jason. Seriously, this imaginary Jason is as scary as you'll ever see him. It's definitely one of the major highlights of the film. But let's backtrack a moment, because I don't want to undermine the film's biggest flaw. No actual Jason? What were they thinking? Now, it's not necessarily Jason's absence I take issue with. It's the way it was handled. I don't mind Roy's reasons for taking revenge, as they draw strong parallels to Mrs. Voorhees from the original Friday the 13th. But it's made so blatantly obvious that Roy is the killer that the film's not even effective as a whodunit. It also doesn't help that when Roy's identity is revealed, the survivors don't even know who he is or why he was trying to kill them. When it's all said and done though, this entry has just enough going for it to make for a fun ride, even if it doesn't quite stack up to the upper tier movies in the franchise. The Friday the 13th series has never been known for its continuity, and Jason Takes Manhattan is a prime example of that. I mean, Camp Crystal Lake is suddenly just connected to the ocean? A major criticism of this movie is with the title. It's called Friday the 13th Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan, yet Jason doesn't even sniff New York until the final act of the movie. Despite the misleading title, I actually prefer the film panning out this way. The ship, known as the Lazarus, is creepy, narrow, and claustrophobic. Not only is it a great setting for Jason to take out his victims one by one, it was a welcome change from the backwoods backdrop from the previous 7 movies. Kane Hodder always plays a great Jason. Here, he's meaner, slimier, and he's even learned how to teleport. Rennie and Sean have pretty decent chemistry, and their innocent romance contrasts nicely with the villainous principal Charles, who is also Rennie's guardian. You'll hate this guy the moment he's introduced, up until his death, but he plays his character well, and he steals the screen better than anyone in this movie not named Kane Hodder. The film also boasts arguably the most iconic death in the entire series. No matter how many times I've seen it, it's always a blast to watch. On the negative, the characters are not near as rich as they have been in prior sequels. And even though the Jason on a boat premise is refreshing, you can definitely tell the overall quality of this movie has taken a dive from the entries before it. The pacing bogs down in some spots as well, especially at the end. But when it comes down to it, this is still Jason on a boat. And no matter how much you may or may not like this movie, it stands out for that reason alone. I may catch some grief as Jason Lives is considered a fan favorite, but the number one issue I have with this movie is that it's not scary, and I think that all starts and ends with the man himself, Jason Voorhees. Simply, I just don't think this is a good Jason. I don't know if it's the mask that's too wide, the yellow gardening gloves, the commando-like utility belt, the super serious Jason walk, or the actor portraying him, but there's nothing about this Jason that's intimidating. It also doesn't help that the film shows way too much of him. In the previous movies, the filmmakers utilized point of view for the majority of the runtime, keeping Jason or the killer hidden as much as possible, and not fully revealing him in all his monstrous glory until each film's climax. Essentially, it was the Jaws effect. Don't fully reveal the shark until towards the end of the movie, because it builds anticipation, and because the more we see of the shark, the less scary it is. It really is the same principle here. But in part 6, we're constantly laying eyes on Jason, and because he's not scary, it's not as effective. Parts 7 and 8 follow the same path by consistently showing him, but it helps when you have Kane Hodder as well as better makeup and costuming, especially in regards to Part 7. With that said, I like everything else about this movie. The cast is great and one of the best things the film has going for it. Tom Matthews is solid as an older Tommy Jarvis, and Sheriff Garris is excellent as his nemesis who doesn't believe his story about Jason coming back to life. The sheriff's daughter Megan also works wonders as Tommy's love interest. She throws a wrench in their feud and propels the narrative forward by trying to help Tommy prove his innocence. The climax is great, and I love Tommy trying to send Jason back to his original resting place at the bottom of Crystal Lake, or should I say Forest Green. The film also does a great job at mixing in humor.
Does he think I'm a farthead?
Despite my criticism of Jason, this is without a doubt one of the most fun and rewatchable entries in the series. In theory, Part 7, The New Blood, shouldn't be this high on this list. Outside of Jason Goes to Hell, the premise is the most absurd of any of the 12 films. In fact, you could go ahead and call it absolutely nuts. While Jason was human in parts 2 through 4, I could buy that he was able to survive so much damage because of the odd shape of his skull. In a way, it's almost like his deformity protected him. Then part 6 comes along and asks us to accept some movie magic as Jason rises from the dead courtesy of a lightning strike. But part 7 says, hold my beer. The New Blood asks us to accept that Jason is able to keep rising from the grave and a main character that has telekinetic powers. Why? Who cares? We're at the 7th film in the franchise, and honestly, Jason vs. Carrie is a lot of fun. Tina Shepard makes a solid opponent for Jason, and her abilities make their climactic battle that much more unique. It's also one of the better climaxes in the series, and Jason's unmasking is super freaky. This is a massive improvement from the Jason in part 6, as it's clear the production team went all out to make the scariest and most intimidating Jason they could. One thing I like about these later entries is the villain's not named Jason, and Dr. Cruz is a perfect villain. He pretends to help Tina, but in truth, he's been lying and manipulating her, with his real aim to rile her up and expose her telekinesis for his own personal gain. It's unfortunate the MPAA butchered his death scene, because he deserved the most gruesome exit, especially after sacrificing Tina's mother, just to buy himself another second to escape. Much has been said about Tina and Nick and their supposed lack of chemistry. Maybe they didn't get along on set, but I actually think they're pretty good on screen together. You can tell Nick genuinely cares for her, and it's clear she appreciates there's a good guy who still wants to get to know her through all her weirdness and baggage. It's a scenario where I definitely root for them as they encounter and try to survive Jason. Now, I'd be remiss not to mention the fact that The New Blood has without a doubt the dumbest, most awful ending ever. Not just in the Friday the 13th franchise, but in any movie altogether. And I absolutely mean it this time. Tina's father, who's been dead for 10 years, rises from the lake to pull Jason under. Yep, that's how Jason's defeated. Why he looks the way he does, I don't know. Why he was even in the lake and not given a proper burial, I also don't know. At this point, I just assume the filmmakers were on crack, or when trying to figure out an ending, had a complete mental breakdown. With that aside, as silly as this film's premise is, it never comes off as a joke, and the tone is reminiscent of the first 4 Fridays. Overall, though The New Blood isn't as slick as Jason Lives, I think it's definitely scarier, with a much better Jason and one of the more intense climaxes in the series. And here we are, the final 4 Fridays, or should I say, the original 4 Fridays. There are numerous reasons I feel these movies are the best the franchise has to offer, but for me, the standout reason is the use of dramatic irony, or more specifically, the way in which it's used. It's the fact that characters are unaware that a killer is taking them out one by one, and it's not until the inevitable point late in the film that the remaining characters begin to wonder where everyone went. This is a hallmark of the classic slasher, and it's not until Jason Lives does the series begin to break that mold. There are exceptions where it makes sense not to use this formula, such as in the Whodunit, or where characters are trapped in their environment and they're left with no choice but to fight back. But for this series, especially in the early movies, I find this formula to be the most satisfying and suspenseful, and definitively what makes a Friday the 13th a Friday the 13th. There's something so simple and beautiful about the original film. The quiet sounds of nature, the lingering shots of the lake and surrounding woods, the characters in the community, and the time taken to establish this backwoods setting all help to create a mood and ambiance that was never matched outside of the original. I've always been a firm believer that horror films work best when they slowly build. This allows not only our anticipation to grow, but also makes us feel as though we're a participant, right there in the woods and camp setting alongside these would-be counselors. Even though the characters aren't the best, they do feel authentic. From Annie to the diner folks, all the way to Kevin Bacon and Mrs. Voorhees. And obviously we can't forget Ned. These characters genuinely feel like they're a part of this world, and never actors on screen. I think this is an overlooked reason for why the deaths are so impactful. Another reason, of course, is because of the outstanding effects from Tom Savini. The kills can be absolutely brutal. I'm still surprised they got away with what they did in regards to Kevin Bacon's death. It lingers for a solid moment and looks frighteningly real. Beyond the deaths, it's the simple things about this film that are most effective. The camera slowly panning along the office while Alice and Bill break inside to check the phones, and then landing on the slit line is absolute perfection. Even the lingering shot of Steve leaving the diner in the howling rain is impactful. Because of what we've seen up to these points and the impending doom we feel moving forward, simple moments like these carry a lot of weight and value. A good analogy is waiting in line for a thrill ride at an amusement park. A lot of the times, it's the wait and anticipation that's scarier than the actual ride itself. Mrs. Voorhees was a solid killer, and I've always loved how she reveals herself to Alice. Their interaction is great, and I love when Alice begins to realize Mrs. Voorhees is the one responsible for her dead comrades. Unfortunately, the climax is one of the most forgettable in the series, save for the decapitation that follows it. Jason's appearance at the conclusion and the film's final moments make you wonder whether he is actually real. Of course, at this point, we know the truth, but it was an outstanding way to set up a sequel and leave you wanting more. Before I continue, I just want to note that I love these last 3 movies equally, which makes ranking them extremely difficult. In fact, I'm not going to do it.
I'm just kidding. But seriously.
Releasing a year after the original, yet taking place 5 years later, Part 2 continues on the myth and legend of Jason Voorhees. One of the film's best moments comes when Paul, the head counselor, tells the story of Jason around a campfire to the other counselors. It's a dark and ominous mood, lightened by the jump scare Ted delivers at the end. It's a great way to acknowledge the film's growing lore, yet also smartly having the characters disregard it. I say smartly for us, the viewers, but not so smartly for them, because Jason is indeed alive and here to do what he does best. As previously mentioned, I love that the original films do their best to hide the identity of the killer. They slowly begin to reveal more as the film goes along, and Friday the 13th Part 2 does it better than any other Friday. Jason's first reveal is one of his most intimidating appearances ever. The moments leading up to it and the kill that follows is pure suspense. This is also one of my favorite Jasons, as here he is at his most real and frightening. The human, backwoods farmer boy version that suffers from severe elephantitis is leaps and bounds scarier than the slow, careful, Michael Myers-like version of the later sequels. The final chase is great, and the shrine of Jason's dead mother is totally twisted. Amy Steele has always been one of my favorite final girls, and the bit when she pretends to be Mrs. Voorhees to confuse and conquer Jason is brilliant. The one thing I feel drags this entry down is the intro with Alice. Not only is it way too long, it feels completely unnecessary, and it seems odd that Jason would even come out to a suburban neighborhood to begin with. That said, Friday the 13th Part 2 is not only a classic slasher film, it's a classic horror film, with some of the best moments of the series. My very first introduction to Jason Voorhees was courtesy of Part 3, so I thought there might be some nostalgia bias. But the more I watch this film, the more I believe it's right up there with the best the franchise has to offer. Part 3 immediately picks up where Part 2 left off. Also, Jason's grown a foot taller, lost all his hair, and packed on a ton of muscle, all in the span of one singular day.
Does he think I'm a farthead?
Despite that continuity issue, this is by far my favorite Jason. His hulking physicality is complemented by genuinely humanistic traits. He grunts when in pain, gets frustrated on occasion, and seems to show genuine excitement in killing. Like Part 2, he runs instead of walks, which makes he and the climax that much more intimidating and real. That this rendition of Jason was abandoned in the later sequels is truly unfortunate. His makeup effects are also my personal favorite in the series. It's clean, simplistic, and shows off his deformity with great clarity. The film has what I consider to be the two best kills of any Friday film, and the fact they happen nearly back to back strengthens their impact. The spear gun death is insanely realistic, and it's further highlighted by the first ever appearance of Jason in his signature hockey mask. It's a menacing kill, and Jason's nonchalant demeanor make it that much more chilling. Andy's death is also a defining moment in the franchise. It's brutal, creative, and features the iconic monster at his most powerful. The climax is filled with excellent visual moments that stay with you long after the film. I'll never forget when Chris peeps through the eye hole of the upstairs closet, only to find Jason running towards her with an axe. She also puts up a great fight and excellent alternating POV shots before eventually stabbing Jason. The Higgins Haven setting makes for one of the more exciting climaxes. Jason chases Chris through a variety of obstacles and literally over the whole grounds before eventually trapping her in the barn for the conclusion. The iconic axe to the head is stuff of legend, and the dream sequence that follows of a maskless Jason busting through the door is nightmare-inducing. The film's definitely not perfect, as some of the acting can be suspect at times, even from the main character Chris. It's also unfortunate the production team had to create a lake for the movie, as at times it's very obvious that this isn't really Crystal Lake. It would have been nice to have that extra space and depth, and once you're aware of it, it can sometimes take you out of the movie. But Part 3 has too many elements that define the franchise for me to ignore. The imagery, deaths, and intensely heightened moments stay with me more so than any other in the series. And on more days than not, this is actually my favorite Friday. But it's just way too difficult not to put the fourth entry in the top spot. Friday the 13th, the final chapter, has everything you could possibly want in a Friday film. Here you'll find the franchise's best protagonist in a young Tommy Jarvis, the best side characters in Ted and Jimbo, and some of the most gruesome deaths in the series. We're also treated to the creepiest music of any Friday film, one of the better Jasons in Ted White, a chilling climax, and overall the most fun entry in the series. While Part 3 largely ignored the lore of Jason, the final chapter wastes no time in righting the ship. Instead of rehashing the conclusions of the previous films like Parts 2 and 3, Part 4 begins with a montage of the best Jason moments as narrated by Paul from Part 2. It's like the filmmakers are preparing us by saying, get ready cause you ain't seen nothing yet. Rob was also a solid addition to the cast. He claims to be hunting bear, but eventually reveals his purpose is to find Jason and get vengeance for the death of his sister, a counselor Jason murdered in Part 2. His inclusion brings some cohesiveness to the Friday the 13th lore, and it's a nice contrast from all of the characters who seem to be so oblivious to the many murders that have been occurring around the Crystal Lake area. The scene in the tent where he shows Trish the newspaper clippings of a would-be Jason is creepy and unsettling. The introduction of the Jarvis family is one of the film's main strengths. It's unfortunate Miss Jarvis bites the dust, but the brother-sister dynamic with Trish and Tommy makes the film feel more primal and gives the climax more weight. Trish fights for Tommy, even urging him to abandon her just to save himself, but he does no such thing, as his presence in action is crucial to their survival. The final moments before Jason's demise are the stuff of legend. The music, timing of the shots, and hideous reveal of Jason's face is a moment in this franchise that's second to none. After this, the series would never be the same. As I've said before, we don't choose why certain films stick with us more so than others. Friday the 13th Parts 2, 3, and 4 just happen to do that for me more so than any other in the franchise. And the common denominator in these movies is Jason Voorhees. More specifically, he's human. Ultimately, it makes the films more realistic, which in turn makes them scarier. Add that with the classic formula, and in my opinion, you have Friday the 13th perfection. That wraps it up for my Friday the 13th rankings. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know your rankings in the comments below. And for when the day does come around, I'd like to say,
Happy Friday the 13th.